The late afternoon sun cast long, golden rays over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Richmond Hills, illuminating the narrow, cracked sidewalks. Most houses along the street had been well maintained over the years, with fresh paint and neatly trimmed lawns. But at the far end of the street, there stood a house that had clearly seen better days. The peeling paint and sagging porch betrayed its age, and the overgrown lawn hinted at years of neglect. Inside the house lived John Everett, a 78-year-old veteran who had served in Vietnam. John sat in his worn recliner in the small, cluttered living room, staring blankly at the television. The volume was turned low, the muffled sound barely cutting through the silence. A faded photograph of his late wife, Clara, sat on a side table beside him. She had passed away nearly a decade ago, and since then, John's life had become a slow, steady descent into isolation. His only companion now was Max, his old black Labrador, who lay quietly at his feet, his graying fur blending with the worn carpet. John's body had grown frail over the years, the strength he had once relied on, now a distant memory. His joints ached and his breathing had become labored. But the worst of his pain was not physical. It was the loneliness, the suffocating solitude that crept into every corner of his life, a constant reminder that he was now truly alone. The sound of Max's soft snoring was the only thing that broke the silence, offering John a small measure of comfort. He reached down to gently stroke Max's head, his fingers brushing the dog's coarse fur. Max had been his faithful companion ever since Clara passed away, and in many ways the old dog had kept him going through the darkest times. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting the street in shadows. John looked out the window, squinting at the long shadows creeping across the yard. It was quiet, too quiet. Richmond Hills was not the lively neighborhood it once was. Most of the old residents had either passed away or moved on, replaced by younger families with busy lives. No one seemed to notice the old man in the broken-down house at the end of the street. As evening settled in, a sudden noise broke the stillness, a faint rustling, followed by a sharp crack. John's heart skipped a beat. He sat up straight in his chair, straining to hear. Max's ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of movement outside. John struggled to his feet, his knees protesting with each step. He hobbled over to the window, peering through the grimy glass. In the fading light, he could make out a figure moving near the side of the house. Panic surged through him. He fumbled for the phone, his hands trembling as he dialed 911. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Michael Carter sat in the dim glow of his patrol car, parked near the entrance of Richmond Hills. He was a 57-year-old veteran of the force, a weathered man with salt and pepper hair and a calm, steady demeanor. He had seen it all in his years as a police officer, the good, the bad, and everything in between. But tonight felt different. There was an odd stillness in the air, as if something was about to happen. Beside him sat Officer Lisa Matthews, his partner of a few months. She was in her mid-30s, sharp and capable, with a no-nonsense attitude that Michael appreciated. She had transferred from a big city precinct, and although the small-town pace of Richmond Hills was a change for her, she was settling in well. Michael glanced over at Lisa, breaking the silence. "How are you finding Richmond Hills so far? Must be quite a change from the city." Lisa smirked, her dark eyes glinting in the dim light. "It's quieter, that's for sure. Sometimes I miss the buzz, but there's something nice about knowing your neighbors." Michael nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Give it time. This place has a way of growing on you." Their conversation was cut short by the crackle of the radio. Dispatch's voice, crisp and professional, filled the car. "All units, we have a 911 report of a suspected burglary at 1247 Winbrook Street. Caller identifies as John Everett, 78-year-old male, veteran status." Michael straightened in his seat, the casual ease disappearing from his posture. "Burglaries aren't common around here," he muttered, flipping on the siren and pulling onto the street. "Something doesn't feel right about this." Lisa was already reaching for the radio to acknowledge the call. "Copy that, dispatch. Unit 14 responding. We'll be there in 5. The patrol car sped through the quiet streets, the red and blue lights casting an eerie glow on the darkened houses. Michael couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in his gut. Something about this call felt different. Maybe it was the mention of the caller's age and veteran status, or perhaps it was just the quietness of the night. Either way, Michael's instincts told him this wasn't going to be a routine burglary. As they approached the address, the atmosphere grew heavier. Winbrook Street was isolated, with houses spaced farther apart than in the main part of town. Most of the homes here were older, many of them vacant or abandoned. Michael slowed the car as they approached the house. The yard was overgrown, the porch light flickering weakly, barely illuminating the neglected exterior. "Seems like an odd target for a burglar," Lisa said, her eyes scanning the darkened windows. "Not much out here, but old farms and empty houses." Michael nodded grimly. Sometimes that's exactly what they're looking for. Isolated targets, less chance of being seen or heard. They pulled up to the curb, the unease in Michael's gut intensifying. He turned to Lisa, his voice low and serious. "Keep your eyes open. Something about this feels off." As they stepped out of the car, the crisp night air bit at their skin, and their breath formed small clouds in front of their faces. They approached the house cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The house looked even worse up close. Years of neglect had taken their toll. Standing on the porch was a frail, elderly man, bundled in oversized clothes that seemed to swallow his small frame. His weathered face was lined with years of hardship, and beside him stood Max, his old dog, who looked up at the officers with wary eyes. "Mr. Everett?" Michael called out, his breath visible in the cold air. "I'm Officer Carter, and this is Officer Matthews. We received your call about a possible break-in." John nodded slowly, his movements stiff. "That's right, officers. Appreciate you coming out here so quick." He gestured shakily toward the back of the house. "Heard a ruckus earlier, and when I went to check, saw the window was busted. Max started barking, and I think he scared whoever it was off." At the mention of his name, Max's tail gave a half-hearted wag, but he remained close to John's side, watching the officers with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Mind if we take a look around, Mr. Everett?" Lisa asked, her tone gentle but professional. John nodded again, stepping off the porch with careful, unsteady steps. "Of course. Follow me." As they made their way around the side of the house, Michael couldn't help but notice how John struggled with each step. His breathing labored even from the short walk. Max stayed close to his side, moving slowly but steadily, as if offering silent support. The snow crunched underfoot as they rounded the corner. Michael's flashlight beam caught the glint of broken glass on the ground. The window near the back door was shattered, shards scattered across the snow-covered ground. "There it is," John said, pointing to the broken window. "I reckon they didn't expect Max to raise such a fuss." Michael approached the window, careful not to disturb any potential evidence. He examined the break pattern, noting the size of the hole and the way the glass was scattered. Something about it didn't quite add up, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Meanwhile, Lisa had begun to circle the property, her flashlight sweeping the ground. "I've got footprints here," she called out. "Looks like they lead away from the window and toward the street." Michael nodded, making mental notes. He turned back to John, who was standing still, one hand resting on Max's head. "Mr. Everett, did you hear or see anything else? Any vehicles? Voices? Anything unusual at all?" John shook his head slowly. "Can't say I did, officer. Just heard the glass break. And by the time I got to the window, whoever it was had hightailed it out of here." Michael's eyes scanned the area one more time. The broken window, the footprints. It all seemed to line up with John's story, but something still felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than met the eye. "Mr. Everett," Michael said carefully, "do you mind if we take a look inside just to make sure everything's secure?" For a moment, something flashed across John's face. Hesitation, perhaps even fear, but it was gone so quickly that Michael wasn't sure he'd seen it at all. Then John nodded, his expression neutral once more. "Suppose that would be all right. Come on in." As they made their way back to the front of the house, Michael exchanged a glance with Lisa. She gave him a slight nod, confirming that she too sensed something wasn't quite right. The porch steps creaked under their weight as they climbed up to the front door. John fumbled with his keys for a moment before managing to unlock the door. As it swung open with a protesting groan, a wave of warm, musty air washed over them, carrying with it the smell of dampness and neglect. Inside, the house was dimly lit, the few lamps scattered throughout the living room, casting weak, flickering light. The room was small and cluttered, with years of accumulated possessions piled high on every available surface. Stacks of old newspapers teetered precariously, and the couch was covered in a threadbare blanket. Max padded in ahead of them, his nails clicking softly on the worn linoleum floor. He made his way to a corner of the room, curling up in his usual spot by a space heater that hummed softly in the background. John shuffled in behind them, his breathing labored. "Not much to see," he muttered, waving a hand toward the room. "Just me and Max, keeping to ourselves." Michael scanned the room, his eyes taking in the clutter and the worn furniture. It was clear that John had been living like this for a long time, and it was equally clear that he was barely getting by. "Is this the only source of heat you have?" Michael asked, gesturing to the small space heater. John nodded, his face tight with strain. "Boiler gave out a while back. Haven't had the money to get it fixed, so we make do with what we've got." Michael frowned. The heater was barely enough to keep the small room warm, let alone the rest of the house, and with the broken window, the cold air was likely seeping in faster than the heater could keep up. "Mr. Everett," Michael said, his voice gentle but firm, "this isn't safe. Using a space heater like this could be dangerous, especially in the winter. Have you considered reaching out to someone for help?" John's expression hardened, his eyes flashing with defiance. "I've been managing just fine on my own. Don't need charity from nobody." Michael exchanged a glance with Lisa. It was clear that John's pride was a major barrier to him accepting help, but it was also clear that he couldn't continue living like this. Lisa stepped forward, her tone soft but insistent. "Mr. Everett, we're not here to judge you. We just want to make sure you and Max are safe. There are resources available." "I don't need any resources," John snapped, his voice sharp with frustration. "I've made it this far on my own, and I'll keep doing so." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. Michael took a step back, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way to break through John's stubbornness without pushing him away completely. Before he could say anything, Max let out a soft whimper, his body shifting slightly in his spot by the heater. John's gaze softened immediately, his hard exterior crumbling as he shuffled over to the dog. "It's just me and him now," John said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We take care of each other." Michael felt a pang of empathy as he watched John gently stroke Max's fur. It was clear that the old dog was John's lifeline, the one thing keeping him grounded in a world that had largely forgotten him. "Mr. Everett," Michael said softly, "we're not here to take anything away from you. We just want to make sure you and Max are okay. Let us help, just a little." John looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mix of pride and pain. For a moment, Michael thought he might say no again, but then John sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he muttered, his voice rough with emotion, "but don't go thinking I'm some charity case. I don't need anyone's pity." Michael nodded, sensing that this was as much of a concession as he was going to get for now. "We don't pity you, Mr. Everett. We just want to help." As they prepared to leave, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. John was a proud man, and getting him to accept help was going to be an uphill battle. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary call, and whatever had brought them here tonight was about to lead them down a path far more complicated than a simple burglary. As they stepped back out into the cold night, Michael glanced back at the house, his mind filled with thoughts of what lay ahead. The broken window, the worn furniture, John's frail form, and Max's tired eyes, everything pointed to a deeper story, one that was only just beginning to unfold. The following morning, the cold winter air seeped into every corner of Richmond Hills. Officer Michael Carter sat at his kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee while flipping through the morning paper. His mind, however, wasn't on the headlines. It kept drifting back to the previous night, to John Everett and the state of his house, to the old dog Max, and to the brokenness hidden beneath John's proud exterior. Something gnawed at him, a persistent feeling that there was more to the situation than a broken window and a lone old man. He knew John had refused help in any significant way, but the image of the frail man, barely able to care for himself and his dog, lingered. Michael shook his head and leaned back in his chair. He'd been on the force long enough to know when something didn't sit right. This wasn't a burglary issue. This was a man at the end of his rope, too proud to ask for help but in desperate need of it. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Officer Lisa Matthews, his partner. "Morning, Lisa," Michael greeted as he picked up the call. "Morning," Lisa's voice came through, alert and direct as always. "I've been thinking about last night, and I can't shake the feeling that something's off with Mr. Everett. That house. Did you get a good look around?" Michael nodded to himself. "Yeah, I did. The place is in bad shape. He's barely got heat. The windows are broken, and the old guy looks like he's running on fumes." Lisa's voice dropped, a tone of concern clear. "He's not going to make it through the winter in that condition, not with his health and that broken-down heater. We need to do something, but he's too proud to let anyone help." Michael ran a hand over his face, sighing deeply. "I know. I've seen it before. Guys like him, veterans who've been through hell and come out the other side, but they won't take a handout. They've learned to rely only on themselves. But this is different. He's in real danger." There was a pause before Lisa spoke again, more quietly this time. "I was thinking we could try contacting Veterans Affairs or Social Services, see if there's anything they can do." "I've been considering the same thing," Michael replied, feeling a spark of hope. "It's worth a shot. I'll reach out, see if they can help him get back on his feet." After hanging up the phone, Michael spent the next few hours making calls. He contacted the local VA office and even reached out to a veteran support group he'd worked with before. But every call ended the same way, with long waiting lists, overwhelmed social workers, and bureaucratic red tape. Without John's cooperation and willingness to accept help, there was little that could be done in the immediate future. Frustration gnawed at Michael. He had expected this, of course. He knew how slow the system worked. But something about this particular case stirred something deeper in him. He couldn't just walk away and leave John in that situation. Yet without John's consent, his hands were tied. Several days passed, and Richmond Hills was hit by an early winter storm. Snow piled up along the sidewalks and rooftops, and the temperature dropped sharply. The patrol car Michael and Lisa shared was warm, but the cold outside seeped in, reminding them both of the frail old man on Winbrook Street. They had driven by John's house several times during their shifts, but the curtains remained closed, and there was no sign of life from inside. "You think he's okay in there?" Lisa asked one evening as they passed by again. "I don't know," Michael admitted, the unease settling deeper into his bones. "But we can't force him to accept help. I just hope he's managing." Lisa was silent for a moment, then she spoke again, her voice firm. "We can't let this go, Michael. We need to do something." Michael nodded in agreement. "Let's stop by and check in on him, just to see how he's holding up." They parked in front of John's house, the snow crunching under their boots as they made their way up the porch steps. The porch light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the snow-covered yard. Michael knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the still night. For a long moment, there was no response. Michael exchanged a worried glance with Lisa. Just as he was about to knock again, the door creaked open slightly, revealing John's tired, gaunt face. His eyes were sunken, and he looked even more frail than the last time they had seen him. "Officers," he greeted them, his voice rough and hoarse. "What brings you by?" "We wanted to check in on you, Mr. Everett," Lisa said gently. "With the storm and the cold, we wanted to make sure you and Max are doing all right." John hesitated, glancing over his shoulder into the dimly lit house before stepping back and opening the door wider. "Come on in, then." The warmth that hit them as they entered the house wasn't the kind of warmth that came from a heater. It was stifling, suffocating. The space heater in the living room was cranked up to its highest setting, and John had draped thick blankets over the windows to keep the cold out. The air was thick and heavy, and Michael could feel the weight of it as he looked around. Max lay in his usual spot by the heater, his breathing labored and slow. The old dog barely lifted his head as they entered. "You keeping warm?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. John gave a half-hearted shrug. We manage. Lisa's sharp eyes scanned the room, noticing the empty food bowls in the corner, the piles of clutter, and the way John's hands trembled as he moved. She glanced at Michael, her concern growing. Mr. Everett, she began carefully, we're worried about you. The house it's not safe. Is there anything we can do? Anything you need? John's face hardened, the pride that had kept him going for years flashing in his eyes. I don't need anything. We're fine. Michael stepped forward, his voice soft but firm. John, I know you've been through a lot, and I know you're proud of everything you've done, but there's no shame in asking for help. For a moment, John's gaze wavered, the vulnerability showing through the cracks in his stubborn facade. But then, just as quickly, the walls went back up. I've been taking care of myself long enough. I don't need any help. Lisa knelt down beside Max, gently stroking the old dog's fur. He doesn't look too well, Mr. Everett. Has he been eating? John's shoulders slumped, the weight of the world pressing down on him. He hasn't been eating much lately, but I'll take care of him. I always do. Michael exchanged a glance with Lisa, frustration and concern written all over his face. They couldn't force John to accept help, but they also couldn't walk away and leave him like this. John, Michael said, his voice low and steady, we can help you. There are resources, people who want to help you and Max. You don't have to do this alone. John looked down at Max, his eyes clouding with emotion. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence in the room was thick, the only sound the hum of the space heater and Max's labored breathing. Finally, John spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to lose him. The admission hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. For the first time, John's pride cracked, and the pain beneath it was laid bare. We won't let that happen, Michael said softly, stepping closer. But you have to let us help. John looked up at him, the battle between pride and desperation playing out in his eyes. I don't want charity. It's not charity, Michael replied gently. It's what we do for each other. You took care of your country, and now it's time for someone to take care of you. John's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. He nodded, the smallest gesture of acceptance, but it was enough. All right, he muttered, but just for Max. That night, Michael drove John and Max to the emergency vet clinic. The drive was quiet, the tension in the car thick with unspoken words. John sat in the passenger seat, his hands trembling in his lap, while Max lay in the back, his breathing shallow and weak. At the clinic, the vet, Dr. Sarah Collins, examined Max with a careful, professional demeanor. She was a young veterinarian, her kind eyes full of compassion as she listened to John's quiet explanations of Max's symptoms. After a long, tense wait, she returned to the waiting room where Michael and John sat side by side. Max is in critical condition, Dr. Collins said softly, her voice gentle but firm. He's malnourished, dehydrated, and his age is complicating matters. We need to start treatment immediately if we're going to give him a chance. John's face crumpled, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. I can't afford that, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I've been trying, but... Don't worry about the cost, Michael interrupted, placing a hand on John's shoulder. We'll figure it out. John looked up at him, his eyes full of a mixture of gratitude and shame. Why are you doing this for me? Michael met his gaze, his expression unwavering. Because you deserve it, John. You've given so much, and now it's time for someone to give back to you. John said nothing, but the tears in his eyes spoke volumes. Over the next few days, Max's condition stabilized. He remained at the clinic for treatment, and though it would be a long road to recovery, Dr. Collins was hopeful. John, however, was not as easily consoled. The strain of the past few weeks had taken its toll, and despite Michael's best efforts, John retreated back into himself, ashamed of the help he had been forced to accept.